Buonasera, welcome to New York University, Casa Italiana, Zerilli-Marimò, and buon Sant'Ambrogio. Happy St. Ambrose Day. Yes, it's important. St. Ambrose is important because, as you might know, today is the day in which there is the opening performance of the La Scala season. And that's why with Fred, we try every year, if we can, to have an opera-related event here at Casa Italiana at New York University. Our founder, Baroness Mariuccia Zerilli-Marimò, was from Milan. She was there when Maestro Toscanini reopened the theater after the theater was almost completely destroyed by Allied bombings. So there is a special connection between this very, very small stage and the large, grand, and historical stage of La Scala. So we are happy to have a great maestro with us tonight also to help us further celebrate these anniversaries. So buon Sant'Ambrogio a tutti. And I also would like to recognize in the audience the presence of a previous guest of our series, Adventures in Italian Opera, who is baritone Luca Pisaroni. Please welcome him back. And as usual, I don't want to take away from Fred the pleasure of introducing his guest. So please welcome Fred Plotkin and Maestro Harry Bicket.
Thank you very much. I have been instructed to find my light. Here is my light. Okay. And is this on? It's now on. So I wanted to continue a little further on the subject of La Scala. I was there recently and saw a wonderful production of Nabucco and was talking to people about opening night, and I learned something that I didn't know before. I often went on the assumption that La Scala has always opened on December 7th, the day of Sant'Ambrogio, St. Ambrose, the patron saint of Milan. As it turns out, that only has happened since 1951. And the story is, before that, it was the 26th of December, like many Italian theaters. But Victor de Sabata, the conductor, who succeeded Toscanini when Toscanini basically moved here to New York. He became the conductor there in the 1930s, and he conducted through the war. And it was decided in 1951 by de Sabata to move it to December 7th, so that would become the great day of the Milanese. And he conducted there for a few more years. His last performance, I'm told, was the memorial for Toscanini, who died in 1957. De Sabata died 10 years later. In fact, he died on December 11th of 1967, so just 50 years ago, as we're standing here talking. And he is a bit forgotten, and I began to look up a bit about him. He only made one commercial recording, but you all own it. It's the Maria Callas, Giuseppe Di Stefano, Tito Gobbi Tosca from 1953. And had he only made that recording, he'd be remembered for that. But he was very influential in Milan, and then he moved to Liguria, to Santa Margherita, where he died on December 11th, 1967. So worth discovering through pirate recordings. He was the one who was there when Callas, when Tebaldi, when Corelli, when Gobbi, when a lot of those singers were in their prime or just getting started. It was Victor de Sabata, whose name was actually not Vittorio de Sabato, but Victor de Sabata. He was born in Trieste in 1892, when that was still part of Austria-Hungary. Worth discovering. But tonight, we're discovering a wonderful maestro who's very much with us, Harry Bicket, who is artistic director of the English Concert. You are chief conductor of Santa Fe Opera, yes, and from the UK, born in Liverpool, studied in Oxford, studied at the Royal College of Music. You'll tell us anything I've left out. and a marvelous maestro, one who I've admired for a long time. He's currently in New York conducting Mozart's Le Nozze di Figaro with Luca Pisaroni as the Count. And I very much encourage you to see it. There are two casts, and so it'll be on through January, and obviously a masterpiece, and very much worth hearing and worth seeing. So please welcome Harry Bicket. This year, had he lived, Claudio Monteverdi would have been 450 years old. And he was, not only in my view, but many people's view, the first great opera composer. He changed opera. Whether he set out to intentionally change opera, we don't know. But he was the genius who came along at the right place at the right time and wrote operas. We have basically only 3 surviving. But the last of the 3 was L'Incoronazione di Poppaea. The first one we have is from 1607. He wrote it in Mantua, Orfeo. And the other 2 are later, Il Ritorno di Ulisse in Patria, the return of Ulysses to his homeland. And then the great final work, the Coronation of Poppaea. You have a very famous recording of Poppaea. Have you conducted all 3?
Many times.
Many
Absolutely.
times.
Yeah.
And what I'd like to do is start by talking about Monteverdi. And what I thought I would do is ask Julian to play number 1 whenever it's ready. And what I would like you in the audience to focus on, and then I'm going to ask Harry, is the singing style of the era of Monteverdi and how it might be different and what we know about how people sang vis-a-vis how the evolution of singing evolved in opera. So Julian, whenever you're ready.
si può dir di te fortuna, che ciò non si può dir, non si può dir, non si può dir di te fortuna. Che vi credete un te divider fra di voi del mondo tutto la signoria e il governo, escludendo di amori nome che dambe voi tanto i maggiori. Io le virtudi ne insegno, io le fortune domo. Questa bambina età vince d'antichità, il tempo e ogni altro Dio, gemelli siam l'eternità di Dio.
So, Julian, please set up number 3. The sound of singing in Monteverdi, at least in my experience, sounds different even from Handel, who came a bit later. The vowels always sound to the ah, ooh, and they sound more exaggerated, and not just in the extreme comic characters, but even in very beautiful music. Is that intentional? Am I mistaken?
I think, and by the way, that was obviously a traditional production of Popeye that you're seeing there.
By David Alden. Yeah.
Yes, you would have recognized it, Luca, of course. I think it's partly the nature of this style, which has not quite evolved from the completely recitativo style of Cesti and Cavalli, and into Handel, but I mean even before Handel, where things are much more clearly either recitative or aria. And one of the reasons is that this piece, Popeye, was, if you like, the first public opera. Up until then, opera had all been private. Orfeo, that you mentioned in Mantua, was paid for hugely by the sponsors. I mean, and it's one of the reasons, interestingly enough, that of course it has a huge orchestra and chorus and large cast, and then you get Popeye, which is in a public theatre in Venice, and obviously when you're having to rely on selling tickets for your opera, you not only reduce the size of your orchestra dramatically, you reduce the size of your cast, and also you say, well, what does the public want? What's going to sell tickets? And even back then, the idea of not even arias, but ariosos, things that are sort of recitatives, but they have tunes, things that are immediately catchy, which are witty, which are immediately accessible, are things that they want to do. So you heard a very good example of this kind of fusion of things. Suddenly, one moment someone is talking, and the next minute it's an aria. And you can't always tell when one bit stops and one bit starts, and even when they start, you think it might be arioso, but it actually turns out to be recitative, and vice versa. And I think that's an important.
Would you define arioso?
Well, I mean, arioso is it's a little aria, if you like. It's a style of like a little tune that suddenly happens in the middle of speaking. And I keep on talking about speaking because, of course, to go back to Orfeo, the whole origins of opera as an art form came from, two things. One was a slightly misguided idea that they were trying to recreate an ancient Greek way of declaiming text. The idea was that the ancient Greeks, they thought, when they spoke their plays, actually kind of intoned them in some kind of way, and their voices went up and down. It wasn't just like us speaking now. There was a kind of declamatory style which involved notes going up and down. So when in the 16th century in Florence they decided they would try and create this sort of recreation of this, they said, well, let's try and do it. And somebody interestingly said, yeah, but that would be ridiculous, because why would people sing when they could speak? which is a very good question. And then someone else said, yeah, but what if we use the story of Orfeo? Because Orfeo was the man whose speech was song and whose voice tamed wild animals and caused people to stop in their tracks. Now, if we used Orfeo, that would be believable. Now look where we are. I mean, we accept that this art form is on one level a totally false art form, because of course it's ridiculous that people talk about these things by singing. But back then, that was a real concern. So the very, very early operas of Rossi and Cesti and Cavalli were concerned about trying to get the nearest thing to natural speech. And whenever we do Monteverdi operas, a lot of singers come along and they think it's like a Mozart recitative, where you basically, it's all language based, and the fact that it's written in 4 beats and a bar is just a convention, and therefore we just try and make it sound like we're speaking. If you try a Monteverdi opera, if you sing every single rhythm, every note as he writes it, it's pure magic. It just sounds like it should be. And that was the attempt to try and make it as near to natural speech as we could.
So a comment, and then it raises a question, which you just said. The comment is, when I teach Monteverdi, and one of the reasons I love him is, to me, he was the first opera composer who looked at the libretto and composed music that expressed or went to the sound of the words, but also the meaning of the words. And before that, in my view, the composers set words to music, but Monteverdi added a dimension that had not been there before. Whether he intentionally did that or he was a genius, as always happens, when Newton had the apple fall on his head, he figured things out. And similarly, I think Monteverdi looked at text and thought there has to be a more evolved way to express it.
But also, I think that the text was paramount.
Yeah.
That was absolutely the most important thing. And the music only exists because of the text. It's not the other way around.
True.
It's not someone writing a beautiful aria and then saying to a librettist, write me some nice words for this tune I've written. The music comes completely because of that. And also, there were these pieces were plays. I mean, if you did Popea as a play, just had actors say the lines, totally brilliant play. There's a very famous Cavalli opera called Giasone, all about Jason and Medea. And it was famous because I think it's the only case in history where an opera got turned into a play. It was that way around. The libretto was so brilliant that they said, we have to make this into a play.
You said that if you sing exactly as Monteverdi wrote it, it's brilliant. And a lot of people have received wisdom that early opera, we know less, and therefore there's more room for improvisation. Joyce DiDonato was in that chair a few years ago, and she was talking about the difference between Handel and Richard Strauss. That with Richard Strauss, she was doing the composer in Ariadne. She had to sing every single thing exactly as was written, whereas with Handel, she had a lot more room for improvisation, for filling in. Would Monteverdi be more like Richard Strauss in requiring us to perform exactly as written?
I think that we can have a long conversation about musical notation, and which is how it comes down to how do you express in writing what you're trying to, which is something which actually can't really be written down. If you tried to write down a jazz improvisation by Oscar Peterson, you could try to do that. There probably is a computer program that could do it, but it would be nonsense when you actually look at it, because every piece of rubato, every inflection, as soon as you write it down literally, it takes all the music away. And of course, so much of this style we're talking about depended a lot on people's tradition. And that tradition was different in Venice as it was in Bologna, let alone France or Dresden or anywhere else. So composers didn't feel the need to write down the details because their performers would understand the style. And in that sense, I completely agree with Joyce. That gives you the freedom. Music in this period, on one level, is a sketch. But we know from Monteverdi's own writing about his own music that the care he took to write these rhythms and the way he worked again and again and again to get it as feeling as natural as possible is something that I always feel we should try and respect that.
Mm-hmm. Do you ever wonder about the lost works? Because we know that he wrote many more operas between 1607 and 1642 that are lost. And he did a lot of church music, madrigals and so on. But I wish some archive would produce these somewhere. They would appear.
Well, there is a story.
magically.
I met someone once who claimed that they traveled before the war in Italy and they found the lost manuscript for Ariana, and it's in some private estate somewhere. I'm not quite sure if I believe that. But what you have to remember also that in the 17th and 18th centuries, everything was about new music. So this whole idea that you wrote music for posterity was complete anathema to them. And I think if Monteverdi came back today and said, you're talking about me, you're talking about these pieces, you're insane. There's nothing happened between now and when I died. And to a certain extent, I'm sympathetic to that. Even any of these composers. I mean, look at Mozart. We were talking about La Clemenza di Tito, which he wrote while he was dying and in penury, and yet he needed the money, so he wrote another opera, and he couldn't say, well, you already had Don Giovanni, that's a masterpiece, why can't you just give me some more money for that? No, we want a new piece. You have to have a new piece. So this idea that we keep on going back to these masterpieces, and that's a good reason in itself to do it, was not part of the mindset in the composer's time.
Let me give you a bit of background. Those of you who know me from previous talks may recall that I was a Venetian history major. And I specifically studied Venetian history because I wanted to work in opera. And while Venice is not the birthplace of opera, it's the place where opera really took wing. I was born technically in Florence, and it had a good period in the court of Mantova and other courts of north central Italy. But as Harry said, it became a public art form in Venice. Venice being a republic, but also a commercial empire par excellence. In the 17th century, which was really the first century of opera, they built 17 public opera houses where you, if you had a few lira or ducati or whatever the currency was, could go and buy a ticket to attend a performance. In these 17 opera houses in the 17th century, 388 new works were composed. And just as now with Broadway musicals and films, not everything that comes out is a success. But we do have some of the operas, and there are musicians such as Harry and others who try to find more of these works and pursue them and bring them to the public eye. And we'll be talking a little later about Handel, because Handel went to Venice to learn his craft, basically. So the connection will happen. As you began to say, Monteverdi wrote Orfeo for Mantova, where they had a bigger, better court orchestra, including wind instruments. Monteverdi being from Cremona, which is a city of violins and stringed instruments, he had an innate sense of those, and then he added wind instruments beautifully, I think, in Orfeo, beautifully. And of the three big operas, Il Ritorno di Ulisse in Patria is the one I like least, although I love it, because it doesn't inspire me as much musically, and I find it, of course, Ulysses traveled all over, I find it episodic in a way that there's not the building narrative of the other two. With Orfeo, it's the suspense. Will he look back? Will he not look back? And this opera, which is the most complex, is very interesting to me because all the characters are flawed, which is what happens in real life. We're all flawed in one way or another. It makes them more interesting than if they were idealized. When we see works that we have characters who are idealized, it's a little hard to relate in quite the same way. But similarly, and this is so Venetian, the behavior of the characters and the evolution of the plot is very morally ambiguous. And the things that these characters do is not necessarily good. What I'll do is I wrote a brief synopsis for you. In imperial Rome, the courtier Ottone is infatuated with the beautiful Poppaea, but she is Emperor Nero's mistress and has ambitions to marry him. Nero tells the philosopher Seneca of his desire to leave his wife Octavia so that he can marry Poppaea. When Seneca advises against this, Nero ruthlessly has Seneca killed. Uncovering a plot by Ottone and Octavia to murder Poppaea, Nero banishes them both and marries Poppaea. What Venetians knew, and what is not in the opera, is that not long after, Nero killed Poppaea. So the opera is called The Coronation of Poppaea, but the protagonist possibly is Nero, I think, Nerone. And I find that so interesting that Monteverdi in his 70s put this story of violence, of moral ambiguity, of lack of being faithful and so on, right in front of Venetian society, which had many of the same issues. Venetians saw themselves as the new Rome, as the great empire. And Monteverdi was to be the first political opera composer challenging people to look at this mirror of society behavior, yes, from the past, as Verdi did it too, but about contemporary issues. And I don't know if you have a comment on that before we hear Ottavia.
Well, no, I mean, that's a really good summing up of that. But I mean, the other thing to say about Poppaea is that it comes out of the whole carnival tradition in Venice. So I'm trying to think of we talk about it as the first opera, but it's more. It's like well, in England we call them variety shows. I don't know what you have them here. I mean, it has this incredible story, and it packs a real punch, socially and politically. But then suddenly, after a scene of huge pathos, the nurse comes in, who is a man in drag, and then sings some incredibly funny, scurrilous, scatological scene. I mean, it completely undercuts everything that's going on. But this was a long tradition. We still have it in England. Anyone who's suffered through an English pantomime will know what I'm talking about. It's a very, very bizarre art form and it actually comes exactly from the Venetian carnival. I mean, the men dress as women and the women dress as men, and you'll have things of great beauty, and then suddenly the local footballer will turn up in a dress and sing a pop song very, very badly, and we all sort of laugh and think it's fantastic.
Harry, we don't have that here because on New York it's on the street. We don't have to pay money to see that.
But it's also, I mean, a tradition of a lot of these operas, and we're getting on to Handel later, but, the idea of anti-heroes and, I see you've got Ronaldo in front of you, I mean, the idea of taking people who are meant to be better than us and who are meant to be more powerful and just showing that they're deep down, they're exactly the same as us, if not even worse.
So the first Ottavia, who is the wife of Nero, and strangely my favorite character in the opera, I like her music, and I feel bad for her, but also you could tell that Monteverdi wrote for a big star. And one of the biggest opera stars in Italy at that time was named Anna Renzi. She lived a short life, from 1620 to 1661. And she was a smart woman. She was Venetian. She understood how to get better contracts than all the other singers. She got paid half her fee even if she was ill and had to cancel. And and if the entire performance was canceled, she got her whole fee because it wasn't her fault. She insisted the theater buy her all of her costumes, and for the entire carnival season in Venice, she had her own box at the opera, which meant that even on nights when she wasn't singing, she could go to sit in the box or sell tickets to her box to make even more money. But she was a big star. She was a very charismatic singer, and she played the original Ottavia, and I love the aria. I guess it's an aria in late in the opera, Addio Roma, when she says goodbye to Rome after she's been banished by Nerone, by Nero. So Julian, if you please, number 3. Love that. Julian, please set up number 4. So that to me is the first great dramatic aria I know in opera, in terms of chronology. When you conduct that and when you work with the singer, and I'm checking her name.
Maite Beaumont,
Yes.
I think it was.
Maite Beaumont was wonderful.
Amazing, yeah.
how, as a conductor, as a coach, do you develop that performance? You know, of course, the instruments that will be played with them, and you know her voice. In a rehearsal process, how does it evolve? Because it's unlike a lot of the opera where people are moving about. This one is basically still and very emotional.
Well, gosh, there are quite a few aspects of this. One thing is that actually I don't know what instruments are playing. All these pieces are basically your score is a bass line and a vocal line. There's no harmony. There's nothing, and the orchestration is completely up to grabs, depending on how much money you have. We had not a huge orchestra, but we had quite a lot of continuo players. And then as in the course of rehearsals, you decide what kind of orchestrations you're going to use and that. With the singers, I've already talked about the fact that I always start from the basis that they just need to sing, if we just have a tactus of this, and then you see what happens if you just try and get the text exactly on this tactus. Not in a kind of like a driving way, but just that. And then what happens is one of the temptations when you see this music is you end up slowing down at all the fast bits and speeding up all the slow bits. But actually, Monteverdi was very interested in proportion. And so that when the emotion it's like real life. When you start, the ideas start coming faster, you start speaking faster. And that's what gives it its very naturalistic thing. Incredible the way he sets the word addio at the beginning.
Yeah.
And she just goes, ah, ah. And you think she's just saying, ah. She can't get the word out. And then the vocalizing of ah becomes addio. And at the end she says, addio. And the orchestras go, boom, boom. So it's bookended by this incredible, brilliant kind of gestural thing, which is so real that I think even if you don't speak Italian, you get the emotion. And the other thing that's a lot of singers don't get trained in nowadays so much is the rhetoric of harmony. I mean, everything now is so aria-based, tune-based, that so people are thinking very horizontally, and this music is so based around the harmony, so that you have to know that even if your tune looks like that, if the chord underneath is that, then the note that you thought was perfectly innocent suddenly becomes something incredibly powerful. And so how do you match the power of that harmony with the way you sing it? And that can be all sorts of colors. It's not just about taking the vibrato away, which is something that is obviously a tool, but the way that vowel resonates in that harmony, so that you color disperata or anything that you hear that, and that the text is so brilliant in that as well. And I think as soon as people get liberated and they realize that this isn't a matter of a maestro going 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you're late there and that vowel needs to come there, but actually you have to do it, which is on the one hand incredibly exposing. I've had people singing, a lot of this cast, well most of this cast are not early music singers, they're opera singers, but on the one hand they find it terrifying, that it feels like there's no orchestra underneath them at all, so it's like walking a tightrope, but also that they have to propel everything. There's no orchestra providing a Rossini rhythmic drive.
Crescendo.
And then your best thing is to make sure you don't get behind. No, you are responsible. And people say to me, I don't know, that seemed to slow down. And I went, yeah, that's because you slowed down. You're suddenly responsible. Don't make me drive you. If you want it to go, you show us what you're going to do, and all these players will go with you. Because again, I'm not waving my arms, I'm playing, and we're all listening. And if a singer says, okay, I want to move forward. But for a lot of people, that's not an experience you grow up with.
That, in fact, was my question, which I didn't articulate well, but you answered much better. The coordination when you are playing the harpsichord and not doing the customary conducting that you might do in Verdi,
Yeah,
for example,
absolutely.
where you might also be coordinating action on the stage if there's a chorus behind.
Of course.
Here, really, there was a dialogue between the singer and the few instrumentalists in the orchestra and the person playing the harpsichord. You collectively, you are creating a different musical experience than what came even with Handel.
Yeah.
And so this is a very isolated period. So when I originally asked Harry about Monteverdi sounding different from everything else, that really is what I meant, that it just is sui generis.
Well, it's interesting. It's a mixture of improvisation, so there is like a jazz element to it, but it's like all jazz. It's actually very, very disciplined, and the thing I often say to singers and instrumentalists is that in order to be free, you have to be disciplined, and those two things often sound counterintuitive, but just as the fact that you can just splash a lot of paint on a canvas doesn't make you a painter. You can be a very free painter by doing that. Mm-hmm. You look at early Picasso drawings, and they're incredible. I mean, the technique of Picasso was incredible, and yet that allowed him in his later years to create the great masterpieces that he did. Mm-hmm. And I think in the same way that in order to be free, we have to actually have some rules, and we have to say, okay, this is what we have to achieve. But then that should liberate you to feel like you can do more.
You just articulated the central operating principle of the way I live my life, but I've never put in those words. So I thank you for that. I believe in that fully. We're now going to hear, Julia, number 4, which is the final duet of the opera. And it's where finally she is crowned, Poppea is crowned, and Nero and Poppea look at one another and express love for one another. And it's one of the most gorgeous love duets ever. But then I always tell myself, how long did that love last? Not very long.
Yeah, and I think that's the point.
Yeah.
Is that he writes the most beautiful thing you've ever heard, and everybody in the audience gets the cynicism behind it, the irony of it, and the fact that it's like real life. I mean, what kind of lives are these people going to have after this is all over?
Because she clearly was angling for the crown, and he, Nerone, had his own very strong agenda, and none of it is good, but the music is gorgeous. So let's listen, please, to number 4, Pur ti vedo.
You noticed Amour, love, leaving the room. There's that duet started, which I think is a nice touch.
Julian, set up number 13, please. So this is gorgeous music, but it's also very much a duet. And I know Monteverdi wrote others, but this one somehow has a particular vocal blending that is unlike anything that I've ever heard, even after in any other opera. And I think it requires, and I want you to tell me if I'm right or wrong or what you think, a different kind of musicianship among the two singers than other kinds of duets. Let's say a Norma duet, for example, where it's a matter of being with one another and having the notes at the right place. But I sort of felt that it was like melting together. So
well, I would argue that it should always be that way. But I mean, I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
I know what you're saying. I think
Yeah.
it because this is so exposed.
Yeah.
That
Exposed, yeah.
the blend, absolutely where you think the harmony is going, and also it's as you say, it's an unusual duet in that it's this idea of these two people coming together. But as you know, these suspensions and these clashes also talk about the fact that they're not really. Yes, they end on the same note and they start on the same note, but in between, it's like they're trying to find their way, and I think that also sums up their
and I think
relationship.
David Alden did something elegantly simple and brilliant. They walk to one another, but then they walk around one another rather than merging as we would expect lovers to do. They stake out their independence again. That's a beautiful bit of stage direction. That was Bea Pearson was the soprano and Sarah Connolly the mezzo. And I was emailing with Sarah Connolly this morning, which is the wonderful thing about email, that if I had a question, I could write to the singer and find her. And talk about it. And Julian is setting up Agrippina by Handel. And Agrippina is a fascinating transitional opera. She was a relative of Nero, of course. And movie lovers, Stefano probably knows this, there was a movie in the early 1950s, I think it was called My Mother Agrippina, and Alberto Sordi played Nero, and Gloria Swanson in Italian played Agrippina. And it's one of the best, worst movies you'll ever see. It was, and Brigitte Bardot was Poppaea. Stefano, you know that film? No. Oh, we have to do movie night here one night. I will present that film as the best, worst movie ever made. But it was a comedy too, allegedly. But we now have Sarah Connolly playing Agrippina, a woman, and we just had her as a man. Now, this is as old as opera, but if you could talk to us about, in the absence of castrati nowadays, how one decides which voice should go with which role when you're casting an opera.
The best one.
Okay.
No, I mean, I of course, I grew up in the era of the renewed interest in Handel opera, and a lot of that, it came about for lots of reasons. One was these masterpieces were sitting there waiting to be staged. When I grew up at university and at music college, there was I didn't know anything about Handel, and certainly the operas, people said, yes, well, there's some marvelous music, but they're not really very theatrical and totally unstageable. The rigidity of the opera seria, the da capo aria, all these things which people just poo-pooed and said, well, that's the end of that. That was an experiment that never worked. And then I think there were directors. I mean, David Oldham, one of them, love him or hate him, and it was somebody who had a real sense of how to make a da capo aria really work. I mean, does everyone know what a da capo aria is?
I was just going to ask you to define it, please.
So it's very simple. It's the idea of it's like a dance form, ABA, if you like. So the first section is one idea, and then the second section is maybe a contrasting idea, but then it returns to the first music. So it has this circular movement, and it also happens in real time. So for some of these can last for 15 minutes of glorious musical writing, and a lot of people found it very static. And I think someone like David and I know Peter Sellers, another person I've worked with quite a lot, started looking at it and saying, well, what if it's not? What if it's actually like real time, and if it's like real human thoughts? Because I think it's perfectly possible to spend 5 minutes saying, I really love somebody, and then spend 3 minutes saying, but that person just betrayed me. And then say, I really love this person, for 5 minutes. That is a da capo aria. And that's actually a very, very real human emotion. And the beauty of it is that when you say, I love this person the second time, it's the same words, but it's in a completely different context and with a completely different resonance. And as soon as you open your mind to that, I think that's how these pieces come about. That's a slight detour, but that was one of the things I think that helped find a way to make these pieces believable. And the other was singers who could do it. Mm-hmm. And it was also partly the fact that for a lot of time, I know opera requires you to suspend belief, but it was difficult to have a woman playing Julius Caesar. I mean, it was just, people, and that's why for a long time actually baritones used to sing it, but transpose the whole thing down the octave, which causes all sorts of other problems.
Even a bass with Norman Treigle.
Norman Treigle famously did it at City Opera, absolutely. But suddenly to have a David Daniels, a real masculine man who could play the part and sing as Handel had written it, suddenly opened up all sorts of audiences who suddenly went, well, that's believable. Okay, he sings very high. Maybe that's not very believable, but it's very real. Mm-hmm. And, I did many, many performances performances with David in Munich and Met and all over the place. But of course, Handel himself didn't care so much about that. Yes, a lot of these roles were written for Senesino and the great castrati of the day, but equally, he was perfectly happy to have a woman sing the role. We know that from the first performances of many of his pieces. I mean, in Ronaldo, yes, Ronaldo was written for cantata, but Goffredo, the great leader of the Christian army, was written for a woman. So I have actually no problem with that. And I think, in a way, we've come full circle.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to get to Ronaldo the opera in a moment, but I want to stick with Agrippina for a particular reason. Handel, who was born in Germany in 1685, went to Venice when he was about 20, a little more, and went there to basically swim in the canals of opera and learned the tradition, learned the singing technique, studied the operas, visit the theaters, look at the architecture. If you wanted to know opera, you had to go to Venice at that time. Naples and Paris and other places would rise up, but it really was Venice. And he wrote Agrippina in Venice. It's his Italian opera written for the Italian audience before then going to England to make his career as the great German, British, Italian opera composer that he was. And he brings in all those factors. So let's watch Sarah Connolly's Agrippina and see this as a through line to what later happened with Ronaldo. So Julian, if you please, number 13. Julian, please set up number 7. Sarah Connolly is a wonderful singer whom we do not get enough of in New York. We almost never see her. When I selected this, I was thinking not only of Handel's development, but back to Ottavia and Poppea and Addio Roma, and the evolution of what we might call a lament aria, and how this is different. One of the factors, of course, is that woodwinds are predominant in the scoring, and there's a harpsichord, and there are sort of chilling strings at a certain point. But how did Handel evolve from Monteverdi and the Venetian tradition, according to your point of view?
Well, I mean, he was a magpie, so he picked up everywhere he went. He picked up things. It's very hard to pin down Handel. Of course, in England we like to think he's English. The Germans like to think he's German, and of course he was in Italy. But a lot of his music is very French. It was just a sort of big potpourri of styles. I think what he learned from the Venetian opera experience was about entertainment, and that's really what he was a master at. He knew exactly what to do to get his audiences excited. A lot of it is rhetorical. I mean, he famously uses really not a wide palette orchestrally or even harmonically. Beethoven famously said that if you want to make the biggest gesture with the fewest number of notes, look at Handel. He was very brilliant at saying, if I just place that root position chord next to that root position chord, it has a huge effect. Something that Bach never achieved. I mean, the genius Bach, but I mean, everything was so harmonically, brilliantly constructed. I mean, I think someone did do a computer breakdown of how many chords Bach used opposed to Handel, and Handel used about 1/10 of the number of harmonic possibilities that Bach did. But in the most simple arias, he touches you so profoundly. And I think that's something he learnt from this, the carnival tradition, where a lot of the songs were actually just street songs. And we all know how powerful street songs are, and how, pop songs, I mean, that's the nature of the pop song, is that actually it only contains four chords, but they're pretty good 4 chords.
Yeah.
And, somehow it just sticks with you.
We're going to get into one of those Handel pop songs in a bit. But Handel then went to England, to London, and in 1709, after his Venetian experience, and so he was still very much a young man in his 20s, and London at that time was the largest city in Europe. It had 600,000 people. Paris was second. It had less than 500,000. And third was Naples and then Amsterdam. But London was the big, sprawling capital. It was a commercial seat. It was the seat of an empire. It had a long theatrical tradition, obviously with Shakespeare, but not only. And Handel loved going about town in London, going to the coffee houses, going to gentlemen's clubs. And he was a German, but he very much liked immersing with the other immigrants in London. So there were many Protestant Huguenots at that time in Spitalfields, which is part of London, who became silk weavers, and he liked silk clothing. And if you go to the Handel House on Brook Street in Mayfair, he had a very good house. Anyone know who moved into the Handel House in the 1960s? Jimi Hendrix. And I was there in October. Whenever I go to London, I try to go back to the Handel House. And now, unfortunately, it's called the Handel Hendrix House. And there's as much Jimmy as there is Georg, and which I love Jimi Hendrix, but it's a different thing. But Jimi Hendrix knew what he was doing. He liked the fact that he lived in Handel's house. But Handel knew Jews from Spain and the Netherlands, and he knew Italians specifically, who came as craftsmen to make the beautiful objects that we see, and as musicians. And many of his orchestra members and his singers were Italians. Now, the key thing about Handel to know is he became, based on his Venetian experience, a man of the theater. and he was a theater manager, and his first big hit in London was at the Queen's Theatre on Haymarket, which, when there was a king, became the King's Theatre on Haymarket, and now is known as the Royal Theatre at Haymarket, I think it's called, which is still a wonderful, wonderful theater that you can go to. And Handel learned from Venice and then acquired English taste and loved spectacle. And I think it's a little hard to produce a Handel opera without a vivid theatrical sense. You were saying that initially directors, producers didn't quite know what to do, but now they've come into their own, and there are many thrilling Handel productions.
Yeah, I mean, I think the theatre had a very specific stage scenery. It had a form of two-way mirror. So a lot of these operas, you have these people have to disguise themselves as someone else. In Rinaldo, is a whole scene where Rinaldo keeps on singing to what he thinks is his lover, but it's actually the sorceress, and the two of them have to keep swapping. Now, even nowadays, that's really quite hard to achieve. It also had live birds, so there's an aria for birds, because there were birds, around in the auditorium. I'm not sure if that's allowed anymore. Fountains that would fly up into the sky, and it's a bit like doing Wagner's Ring. I mean, if you can't actually stage all the things he asks you to do, but we try.
At the moment in London, until February 25th, 2018, is an exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum about 7 of the greatest operas ever written. They were not picked because they were great, though they are, but their impact on cities. And as it happens, 3 of the 7 are operas we'll talk about tonight: Popea, Rinaldo, and Le Nozze di Figaro. And if you happen to get to London before then or buy the catalog, the recreation of the stage of the Queen's Theatre on Haymarket is fascinating, because they have these machines that created waves, so that when the Crusaders were going to Jerusalem for the Crusades, they would move these pieces that were blue to suggest waves, and then they would have a ship going along like that, and then a mermaid pop out of the water, and then fish doing that. It's a wonderful piece of scenery, and all it is a series of levers that stagehands would pull on the side. So again, I wrote out a bit of a plot description. I don't do this normally, but I felt for these operas I should. Rinaldo and Goffredo are Christian noblemen engaged in a war against Argante, the Saracen king of Jerusalem. In a bid to defeat the Christian army, the sorceress Armida captures Goffredo's daughter Almirena, who is engaged to marry Rinaldo. Got it? When Rinaldo resolves to rescue Almirena, Argante starts to fall in love with her, which angers Armida, being a sorceress. She gets the great mad scene kind of music. She tries and fails to seduce Rinaldo. Helped by Goffredo, Rinaldo eventually rescues Almirena, and the Christians conquer Jerusalem. In other words, the First Crusade. And it's based on the book Gerusalemme Liberata, which are stories and tales of the First Crusade by Torquato Tasso, who is from Sorrento. And when I go to Sorrento, I always go to the Piazza Tasso, not because of him, but my favorite pizza in Italy happens to be on that square. So I go there. But I always think of Torquato Tasso. And Stefano, to what degree is Tasso still taught in Italian schools?
Very much so. It's part of the canon. All students in Italian high schools
In Italy learn Tasso?
I guess the 4th year of high school.
4th year of high school.
Roughly half of the academic year to an in-depth reading of Jerusalem Delivered.
And unfortunately, we don't have that in America. I can't think of any book that not even The Great Gatsby or Huckleberry Finn that we spend half a year on. But every Italian I've encountered who got to the 4th year of high school knows Torquato Tasso. It's a wonderful book, and I encourage you to read it. And it inspired many opera composers.
Monteverdi himself wrote Combattimento,
Yes.
which is from the same source.
And Rossini and many, many others. It's worth diving into. So, what I'd like to do is watch David Daniels sing Venti Turbini, and then we'll talk about that. So, Julian, number 7.
Speranza nel raggio ritorniare schiorar l'alma smarrita. Sì, adorata mia vita, corro veloce a rompugnar l'inganni. Amore sol per pietà, dammi tuoi vanni.
So before we talk about that, Julian, set up numbers 7, 8, 9, and 8, 9, 10, and 11 that we will hear in sequence. David Daniels was here a few years ago in this chair, and if you go to vimeo.com and enter Fred Plotkin, David Daniels, you can watch his conversation here. He's a wonderful artist. And with him, I always feel it's never just about getting the notes out, but he's so very expressive. This performance that we just saw made me think again about the transition and the great evolution from Monteverdi and Venice to what Handel was doing that really became a new style. And it was not just visual spectacle, though there was, but he revolutionized the sound of singing. how did he do that? And I
That's
just
a
mean
very good
technically, but I
question.
mean, where did the inspiration come from? What was he trying to achieve that was so different from everything that came before?
Well, he was dealing in London. He was dealing with the greatest stars of the time, and by star I just mean I can't think of an equivalent really, because it's not really like even opera stars. It's about, I mean, the castrati particularly. Everybody knew everything about them. It wasn't just their singing. I mean, it's a bit like, you know, they were in Hello magazine, they were on every TV program. Everybody knew who was cheating on who, with who.
They were Kardashians with talent.
Thank you. I was trying to think. I was trying to find some corollary for you. So when they appeared on stage, there was a whole frisson before they even opened their mouths. So this art form, it wasn't some kind of recherche art form for only a small group of people. This was like the most crazily popular thing that existed at the time in London. So that's one thing, is that that a lot of it was about stardom, and a lot of it was driven by stardom. I mean, a lot of the singers were horribly badly behaved. Handel famously threatened to throw one of them out of the window in his house in Brook Street because she was so badly behaved. And so there was that. It's interesting when you read contemporary reviews of the operas. There were singers that, you know, obviously were dazzling in terms of their virtuosity, but the thing that seemed to me, reading it, that was most valued was their acting and their use of words. One singer that he used a lot, Mrs. Kibber, Bernie writes, of course everyone knows she can barely sing anymore, but what she does with the text moved the whole audience to tears. And I think that is a very interesting clue as to the kind of entertainment it was. I think, you know, good singing was absolutely valued, but only as a means to an end. You know, in itself, you wouldn't have got cheered just for singing an aria well. They required a lot more of that.
And how did people who are Handelians, such as yourself, recapture that in modern times? Because the Handel revival, yes, there were certain few works that came in the 60s and before, but really I would say it's more like the 80s and onward where we've seen Handel enter the repertory of theaters such as the Met, where he had never set foot, and much more in the UK, but also in France and many countries. How were we able to reacquire the values of Handel? Through scholarship, but also through performance, or?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think the period instrument world helped a little bit in that, you know, when you try and play this music on those instruments, you suddenly realize that maybe we were being a little bit too heavy beforehand, and that there's much more dance and much more contrast and things. I think that's helped. I think there was also a big thirst for new repertoire, and you know, we're always looking for new repertoire, and here you have these pieces which were totally admired by everybody. I mean, I mentioned Beethoven earlier, who called Handel the best of us all. Mozart, who spent a lot of his early years actually arranging music by Handel because he just admired him so much. One forgets he tends not to be up there with Bach and Beethoven and Mozart and Haydn, but actually in his own day and the 100 years after, he was completely the person that everybody aspired to. I think the audiences, you know, opera houses suddenly went, well, look here, these wonderful pieces. They're tuneful, they're witty, they're funny, they're touching.
Emotional, yeah.
And they have no chorus. They're cheap, you know, and they have a small. I'll tell you a story. You know, some of you may know that my orchestra, English Concert, and I come every year now to Carnegie Hall to do a Handel opera, which is, you know, a complete joy for us. But it was the whole idea was launched at the time, 2007, 2008, during the big financial crash, and I happened to be talking and there might have been a martini involved, I have to confess, with Jeremy Geffen from Carnegie Hall, I said, gosh, you know, how are you dealing with the big financial crisis? He said, well, you know, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say, but you know, we obviously have to keep on planning in the hopes that something will come up. And I think on the second martini, I said, well, why not do Handel operas? Because then a lot of them have never been done in New York. And I said, they're cheap. It's a small orchestra, 5 singers. You know, I mean, it's you know, it's better than bringing the Berlin Philharmonic. Not better than bringing the Berlin Philharmonic over, but you know, it's a safer bet if you're worried about that. And anyway, I didn't hear anything. And about a month later, he got in touch and said, yeah, well, we've been thinking about that. Maybe we'll try that for a year and just see what happens. Well, now, I mean, these things are completely sold out every year, and it's become just a wonderful. It's just wonderful to see how audiences have responded to these pieces.
And the next one is March 25th,
which is Ronaldo.
27th. Ronaldo,
Absolutely.
yeah. When is it? March 25th.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's what it is.
I have a ticket already. So, what I'd like to do to sort of conclude, because tonight's intention, I thank Harry Bicket for this, was to really open your ideas and mind, and all of you watching around the world, to music that we know about but we really don't know about. And I think that we've done a lot of that tonight, and I appreciate it. But what I want to do, if you'll indulge me, is play 4 versions of the same aria, one by a soprano, one by a mezzo, one by a tenor, one by a baritone. It's Handel's arguably his greatest hit, Ombra mai fu, from Xerxes, from Circe. And we could leave the lights on, Julian, and just play the soprano, the mezzo, the tenor, and the baritone, and we'll talk about them after. now the tenor. So I will identify after the singers, but I'll give you one. Renee Fleming was the soprano, conducted by Harry Bicket, and the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment. And obviously, when you have such a big pop tune, which is a gorgeous piece of opera music from Xerxes, we know that initially it was cast or sung by a castrato, and I believe
I think a tenor, actually.
A tenor?
I think, funny
Really?
enough, I think it was.
Okay.
Weirdly, yeah.
All right.
Unusually.
and
But then he rewrote it, yeah. He
For
rewrote
castrato.
it for castrato, yeah.
and it's been sung by every voice.
Yeah.
I couldn't find my Bryn Tervel recording of a bass doing it as well, but every voice has sung this, and often beautifully. But it's always very different, and I think that I would like you to talk about some of the differences in the sound, in the orchestrations, in the performance, in the use of the words that you heard in these different four singers.
Wow. Well, I mean, and what's funny is that, of course, it's from the opera Xerxes, which is about a Persian king. And it's the first, you have the overture, and then you have this aria. And everybody assumes that the aria is this, big emotional moment. And actually all it is an entry aria, and it's an aria to a tree. I mean, he just sort of says, well, under the shade of this tree, and, here I'm going to sit down. That's it. And yet it's celebrated as this, oh, I love that aria. I'm so moved by that aria. It's just so wonderful. And of course, it's just, he knew what to do. I've got this stupid, oh God, this libretto says he sits under a tree. Oh, I'll just write something. But we better write something that keeps people's attention. So, let's write this aria. So, if you want me to talk about the use of text and
Yeah.
the emotional content of this, it's very hard to do because, of course, it is actually, on one level, it's not a deep text, but it is, as you say, one of the most famous things he ever wrote. I said before that the 18th century didn't mind about what sex was singing the role. They did care about pitch, though, what was interesting. So, in other words, a castrato or a soprano could sing the same music. He did a revival and the castrato wasn't available. He'd use a soprano or vice versa. But if it was going to be a bass or a tenor, then he would rewrite the music. Mm-hmm. So he would never do what these guys have done, which is basically just to sing the thing down. Well, the baritone sings it down the octave. The tenor, I'm not quite sure. Not quite sure what the tenor was doing.
In German.
In German as well, exactly. But I mean, I suppose that's the power of great music, is that it doesn't really matter because it's still, the music survives. I mean, in terms of the orchestrations, of course, you've got a period orchestra playing in the first one, a modern orchestra playing in the second one, but still playing Handel's orchestration, and then the tenor was, I'm not quite sure. I mean, that was
It sounded like
an
the
astonishing arrangement, but very beautiful. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, still wonderful, I thought. And the baritone baritone basically sang the mezzo key, but down the octave.
Yeah. The mezzo her interpretation was slower.
Yeah, it's fascinating. You've put the timings. That's why I keep on looking at this. So, Ombra Mai Fu, it varies from 3 minutes 4 to 4 minutes 19.
Yeah.
Which, for a piece that only is 20 bars long, is pretty spectacular.
It's an amazing variation. And I guess going back to Joyce DiDonato's point and what you said, is that there does not seem to be, or people don't observe, certain kinds of rules, interpretive rules, unless they are, but they very much invest their own character, their own talents.
Well, you're not given. I said earlier that these pieces are sketches. You're not given information. This aria is sometimes known, and you see it written down as Handel's Largo, which is interesting because the word Largo doesn't appear anywhere in Handel's writing. It's totally made up. I don't know where it comes from. So you're lucky to get a tempo marking, any kind of indication of character, any articulations, any clue whatsoever, and all one can ever do, the two things in an aria for me is find an affect, in other words, what is the piece about? Now, okay, it's about a tree, but it's obviously about the joy of nature and of sitting under a beautiful tree, and so that gives you a clue. And then you have the human voice. I mean, I don't think it's changed a lot, and the voice can, in terms of a tempo. Are our lungs any bigger now than they were back then? I don't think it's quite like the Olympics where people run faster every year. I think you go, well, this is this, if assuming that the singer sang that in one phrase because it's one sentence, what is comfortable and what makes sense?
I'm going to ask the audience. We know that the soprano was Renee Fleming. I think that the mezzo may be the hardest to identify because she's the least known. She's a contemporary artist. I've worked with her. I think she's one of our finest mezzos. We've not seen her too much in New York. We see her more in Santa Fe, in San Francisco. She just had a big hit in London at the English National Opera. Anyone know who that might have been? She's an American from Texas with a Russian mother. Pardon me? And her father is a descendant of a very famous explorer who got to Hawaii and Polynesia, Sasha Cook. If you don't know her, I strongly recommend. She's a wonderful, wonderful
and she'll
artist.
She'll be here singing in Ronaldo. In fact, she's
Yes.
singing Goffredo in Ronaldo at Carnegie Hall in March. So
That's why I picked her.
yeah, yeah.
Because I think she's a really marvelous singer who we don't get to hear as often as I'd like to. The tenor, I will just say parenthetically, if I had to name my favorite tenor of all, that's my favorite tenor. Any guesses? Pardon me? Fritz Wunderlich? No. Nein. Anyone else? Vingassen? No. I'll give you a hint. He's no longer with us, unfortunately. His father was Austrian. Alfredo Kraus. Yep. Did you?
I didn't know. I couldn't know. I mean,
Yeah,
that's amazing.
I mean, it's really hard to tell that's Alfredo Kraus. And the baritone, Dmitri Vorostovsky, who died recently, and joined us in this chair. And again, go to Vimeo and enter Fred Plotkin, Dmitri Vorostovsky. Since he died, that particular video has sort of gone viral, and a lot of people have visited that. Did I leave anything out about Handel?
Not if you're not going in a couple of hours.
All right. Well, and then there's Mozart, about whom I will simply say that Harry Bicket is conducting Le Nozze di Figaro at the Met. Not to miss, Luca Pizzaroni is a wonderful Count Almaviva in the first part of the run. It has a great cast, and it's still very funny. I went last night, and you'd think for all the times that I've seen it that the last would go dry, but when it's funny, it's really very, very funny. So I commend it to you, all of you, and I especially thank Harry Bicket for really teaching us so much tonight. It was a great visit that we had here. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.